Welcome to a new episode of Film Seizure at the Movies. I'm Geoff Arbuckle, co-host of the Film Seizure podcast that you can catch each Wednesday morning with my cohorts Jason Oliver and Chuck Moore, and my solo show, Monster Mondays, each Monday afternoon. You can catch both of those shows at filmseizure.com. Well, talk about two very different movies to talk about on the same episode. First, we have Scream, the fifth film in the Scream franchise, and The King's Daughter, a movie that, well, we'll talk about that in a bit. But let's start with Scream. I've long said that I'm not the biggest fan of the Scream movies. In fact, I don't remember if I saw the third film at all, and I know I didn't see the fourth. And I definitely didn't watch any of the TV show stuff that MTV did. At least I think it was MTV. My issue with the first movie in the series is more with what it inspired, which is totally unfair. I know this. I can't take Scream to task for the poor PG-13 slasher movies that came later in the 90s. It would be like being spiteful of Halloween for inspiring the slashers of the 80s. I get it. I just also came from a time in which my education in horror happened at a way younger age, and thanks to having older brothers, I was exposed to stuff that came out in the 70s and 80s at a much wider list of those movies than people my age. So when Scream came along in the mid-90s, I didn't need the cursory education on rules of anything in horror films. Yes, I know it seems like the Jamie Kennedy character did more than just a cursory review of the so-called rules of horror movies, but I can refute a lot of them with movies because of my own education, so take that, Scream. Still, the first Scream film is fun and had a life to it, and it kept horror and the slasher subgenre afloat during the last decade of the video store era. So how about Scream 5? Well, this is definitely a fun time at the theater with asterisks. It's a new generation and new cast taking over for the series. Yes, legacy characters played by Neve Campbell, Courtney Cox, David Arquette, they all return for one more go-around. It's Arquette who gets most of the screen time, and that's a real blessing because his character has been a series favorite for many fans. This new cast all have some kind of connection to characters from older movies. All the attacks by this new Ghostface are entirely focused on them. Now, with the legacy characters coming back, though, it adds a different level of intrigue to the villain or villains' motivations. The movie does some things well. I kind of like the viciousness of the killings. That fits with this franchise. I know I complained rather mightily against the viciousness of Halloween Kills, but Ghostface always did seem like a little bit more of a violent killer. After all, his primary weapon of choice is a hunting knife, so that's going to do a lot of damage when you start stabbing people with it. This film is also coming from an excellent premise to satirize, and the idea of soft reboots, which this film calls a requel. It's mostly satirizing how movies like the latest trilogy of Star Wars movies bring in a brand new cast while still retaining members of the old cast to help transition from one generation's films to the next. Now, we all know how well these things go with people online, and that usually creates a lot of animosity from people who think that they know what's best for their beloved movies that end up getting sequelized. It is funny how this script deals with that concept, as long as you can stay with the movie to the conclusion that this sets up. When the movie, when it comes to its cast, I would say that it's great to see Neve Campbell and Courtney Cox again, but the greatest pleasure was seeing David Arquette go from this broken, massively scarred and injured man from the 4 previous films to being a breath of fresh air for the guys like me in the audience. That's because he has to interact with these newer, younger people making up the cast, and he looks so old and confused about how much they worship this history of these killings that was very much part of his life. It's like they know more about him than he knows about himself, and it's really funny seeing him interact with some of these people in a couple of these scenes. However, the new cast are massively grating to me. Some more than others. However, those who grate, very much grate. The biggest trouble with these characters are that they are horribly mismatched as a group of friends. Some of seem to, really care about one another. Some are too busy accusing the others of being Ghostface. And one is so instantly and incredibly unlikable, that person is involved in some way, and if not, it would be a horrible red herring. It just made it an impossible situation for that person. If the person is the killer, it was too obvious. If that person wasn't the killer, it's a very obvious red herring. You never got the impression that the new cast takes anything seriously, or that they're even friends, to be honest with you. Then there are two sisters who are estranged, and their dialogue once they reunite is about as bad as daytime soap opera stuff. I actually chuckled with my head in my hand over some of their dialogue multiple times in this movie. In all, if you're a fan of this series, you'll probably be satisfied. If you aren't that big of a fan of the series, it will be a mixed bag. For me, it was sort of a mixed bag, but a fun one. I saw this a week ago and was originally sitting on the C+ line for the movie's grade, but it was close enough for me to say that I can upgrade it to a light B-. But I will say that Film Seizure co-host Chuck Moore, who does like this film quite a bit, he likes it quite a bit more than I do and considers it possibly the second best of the franchise. So that should tell you that you'll likely be satisfied as a fan of the series. But our second movie to talk about is absolutely not a mixed bag. The King's Daughter had a troubled history getting from production to screen. The film rights were first obtained way back in 1999. This was based on a book that was released, I think, in 1997 or something like that. And it also has a different title. I forgot to put that in my notes. But it didn't get made. It did struggle for a few years to get into production, but it wouldn't be until 2013 that Paramount finally put the movie into production and it was able to move forward. The movie was completed and ready to be released by April of 2015. However, only 3 weeks out from its scheduled 2015 release, it was pulled from the schedule. Paramount didn't put a replacement date of any kind, only saying that the special effects needed more time to be completed. It ended up getting passed around until it finally landed in the lap of independent distributor Gravitas Ventures. Now, after almost 7 full years, The King's Daughter is in theaters. I didn't see anything but a poster at the AMC theater that I go to, and I did get an email from AMC saying, hey, why not come and see this movie? So I did, and then I realized it maybe didn't need to be released at all. Pierce Brosnan stars as King Louis XIV. He's recently returned from a long, expensive war, and he's shot by somebody who is a dissenter, and comes to the realization that maybe he's not as immortal as he once thought. So he decides to send people to look for Atlantis and the sunken continent's fabled mermaids. You see, female mermaids have hearts that, if you sacrifice them during a solar eclipse, will make you immortal. Sure. Now, there is a problem here, though. Louis has a daughter, and this woman is played by the always easy on the eyes Kaya Scodelario, and she was raised in a monastery by the sea. She never knew her parents, and she has an affinity to go swimming in the sea. Now, this is something that the nuns at the monastery absolutely hate. They say it's the devil calling her out to sea. I don't know what that's all about. Why build your monastery on the sea? But I digress. Louis has been keeping tabs on her, and around the same time he calls for her to come to Versailles for, to be honest with you, I don't know why, his royal fishermen have captured the all-important mermaid. Now, the mermaid had a mate, and without her merman, she's depressed, which means that she can't be dissected properly. The royal fisherman needs to nurse the mermaid back to perfect peak health. Well, that is what Scodelario's Marie Joseph will do. The daughter is ultimately made the king's music conductor that will play music for him every morning and is cared for by the king while she ultimately discovers that the mermaid is there and ultimately befriends it. So, let's start picking things apart like so many female mermaids. This is obviously a fantasy. However, I'm not exactly sure who this movie is for. It's rated PG, but there's talk of vivisection and dissection of a mermaid. I saw it in the theater with 5 other people in the auditorium. All of us were 30 or older, and in a couple of cases, they were much older. I don't know if there's anything about this movie that would appeal to younger girls. It would most definitely be younger girls that would be the audience, I would think. But a teenager? No, that's a little too cheesy for a teenager to like. Maybe preteen, but there's that whole dissection thing. Next, this movie has a visual split personality. I think it wants to say something about the upper class in France. While the inside of the palace and Brosnan's costume design and every single thing about Scodelario are all good looking, but there's a lot of ugliness in this. Every other woman outside of the king's daughter's lady-in-waiting, they just look haggard. They are poorly made up. Their hair looks like rat's nest. It's ugly. It has a look that makes you think that it smells bad. Then almost every man, except for the daughter's love interest, the royal fisherman, is very foppish and effeminate. They all have the exact same hair based on their standing, and they all have caked on eyeshadow. It's just not appealing to the eyes at all. Then there are these various spatterings of shots of people who just hang out around the outside of the palace. Either have more people or have none people at all. Having the random 2 or 4 people makes it feel empty. It makes an already seemingly low budget film trying to get by on the palace and some costume design look even cheaper. There are lots of little things that are confusing as well. Never mind the whipping the audience around for the first reel, which with quickly edited exposition dumps. The first problem is that we talk about sacrificing the mermaid at a specific time, but then later, it doesn't matter if the mermaid is already dead. It's just harvesting the heart for the immortality juice at the eclipse. But then, as the eclipse happens, and it's now or never for the death of the mermaid, there would be no possible way to get the heart in time. It's so confusing. But then, to talk about confusing, this king has a daughter, right? She doesn't know that he is her father. He treats her with a great deal of care and grace. He even teaches her how to dance so that she can potentially dance with a rich guy that the king wants to marry her off to for money. Not that she knows that, but you expect her to think that he's trying to court her. There's no reason for her not to think that after he plucked her from the convent and promoting her all the way up to royal conductor, that he's not doing this for some ulterior motive. Again, she doesn't know what her relationship is to the king. He even takes her to this romantic place and sketches her and says that no other woman has been there for like 20 years. So why doesn't she think the king is trying to make her into a queen? It's a little too precious and very naive to take seriously or believe. There's also a weird narrative that begins to play out in the final act that feels like the science is the bad guy narrative. And while the king's main bishop or priest or whatever he is, played by William Hurt, is trying to state that not only that the science is wrong and that faith is what is needed to guide you to the right conclusions or whatever, but it becomes a bit too obtuse in that argument over what is right and what is wrong to do with the mermaid, which is probably would come down to maybe not sacrifice it for immortality. And I would feel like that would be the position that both a religious and scientific person would get behind. It just felt that the king's science man was becoming more and more of the villain for kind of silly reasons. And all of that is much worse than the knowledge that the palace at Versailles has a place to keep a real mermaid. In the end, I can forgive some of the more cheaper stuff, like the sparsely populated people outside the palace, or the look of the mermaid cave, or the poorly shot slow-mo, which is a personal pet peeve of mine. the bad makeup for the haggard women that I think are supposed to be whores that hang out around the king, and more, because this seemingly was a low budget film. But yeah, the movie still cost $40 million. Some of that may have been because of promotional. It had to promote itself twice, but I can forgive a lot of this. It's the fact that this is in theaters. It looks and moves and feels like a TV movie. If this showed up on Disney Channel or the Hallmark Channel, that would be a good place for it. Even if it was deposited onto a streaming platform after the 7 years of it not being able to get out, that would be fine. I could accept that. But it looks like something that just wasn't ready for the big screen. Now, while I will say that this is a very poor movie and it will stay near the bottom of the list for the whole year, I'm sure it won't be the worst film of the year by this time next year. It's maybe not for me, but I don't know who this movie is for. It feels slapdash. It might have been sliced and diced over the past 7 years to try to edit it down to its 95 minutes that it is. But it just doesn't work on almost any level. In review, I give a marginal recommend to the new Scream film, and a definitely do not recommend to The King's Daughter. Now, don't forget to follow Film Seizure at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram so you can be made aware of new episodes of our various shows as they drop. You can also follow us at podcast providers like SoundCloud, Google Podcast, Apple Podcast, TuneIn, Stitcher, Spotify, and Audible. You can also listen to the show on YouTube by subscribing there as well. I'll be back next week with my top 10 of 2021 special. So until then, don't forget to save me the aisle seat.